Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Great Lakes Seminar Series. We have our numbers are still going up pretty quickly, so we'll give it just another minute or two to get started. Okay, well, again, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Great Lakes Seminar Series, co-hosted by the Cooperative Institute for Great Lakes Research and the NOAA Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory. My name is Greg Dick, and I'm the director of SIGLR. It's my sincere pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Sara Hughes. Dr. Hughes is an associate professor of environmental policy and planning in the School for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on environmental policy agendas, policy analysis, and governance processes, focusing on decisions about water resources and climate change. Current projects examine the political and institutional dimensions of equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water in the U.S., the role of municipal finances in drinking water management and investments, and urban climate change governance, including equitable approaches to building urban climate resilience. She leads the Water and Climate Policy Lab at SEAS. Sara has just recently joined us at SIGLR as the Associate Director of the Cooperative Institute for Great Lakes Research, where she will be leading and growing our work in the social sciences and policy engagement, which of course is highly complementary to what we do, mainly in the natural sciences. So before I turn it over to Sara, I'd like to remind everyone to please leave your microphones muted for the duration of the webinar. You're welcome to enter questions in the chat box at any time during the presentation, and we'll moderate that at the end of the presentation. And with that, I'll turn it over to our speaker. Welcome, Sara.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation to speak today and share some of my research. Really looking forward to it, and hoping there'll be enough time at the end for some good questions and discussion too, which I'm looking forward to. I will go ahead, pull up these slides. Best laid plans. All right, great. I think we're good to go. So I want to talk today about some of the research we've been doing over the last 2 or 3 years, focused on adaptation in cities, and specifically climate adaptation strategies and policies in cities of the Great Lakes, different ways of supporting just and equitable outcomes in that space, and then also some areas and opportunities that I think are pretty ripe and important going forward. So just to set the stage a little bit for this issue, this challenge we're facing, I'll give a little bit of context to why I think this is so important. First, in our region, we're seeing we're becoming an increasingly urban region. More and more people are living in cities. This is an image showing the change in night lights between 2012 and 2016. So fairly recently, even, we're seeing kind of growing urban numbers in the region. So we got more people living in cities, meaning that more of our economic activity and more of our vulnerability is located in our urban areas. Second, we are undergoing a lot of change in the Great Lakes in a lot of different dimensions, and I'll highlight just a couple. Of course, we face the challenge of climate change and all that that brings. So we know that due to climate change, we're already facing growing vulnerability to various types of climate risks, both acute ones that kind of happen at a specific point in time, things like floods, storms, fires, heat waves, and droughts. These are things, challenges that we're already facing on a more frequent basis and will continue to going forward. This, some of these data I'm showing on the right here from GLESA, I think really highlight these changes well, right? This map on the top showing how Michigan's climate is going to increasingly look like the climate of those states to the south of us over time. And the bottom figure showing some of the changes in precipitation that we're expecting in the region as well. And these types of climatic changes don't only produce these kind of acute disaster type events, they also introduce chronic strains on our service delivery and infrastructure, things like our drinking water infrastructure, energy provision infrastructure, flood mitigation, transportation networks, our heating and cooling needs over time. And so they present also this kind of broad and persistent challenge to our infrastructure and services. Another way of thinking about change, or another dimension of change perhaps in the Great Lakes region as well, is the fact that over time our infrastructure, this infrastructure I just mentioned, is aging and is at this point, in many cases, quite old. And this is kind of adding to the strain and the vulnerability that we're facing in relation to climate change. So this map on the left shows what are considered high hazard dams in the region, and those that are intersecting with darker colored areas are ones that are near higher or like larger population centers. We know that some of our infrastructure failures are also making our stormwater, our flooding events more serious. This is an image from the flooding in Detroit a couple years ago when some of the pumps failed and we saw that flooding on the highways. So we have this aging infrastructure that's kind of coupling with and exacerbating the types of climate changes and challenges that we're facing. The third dimension here I want to emphasize is the fact that we have some deeply embedded and very significant forms of inequality in the Great Lakes region that are not unrelated to these other changes and challenges. So there's a history and both a social and an institutional and political history to this inequality. A lot of it driven by the Great Migration that took place in the early 20th century that saw more than 6 million African Americans moving from the south to the north. This is when a lot of industrial centers were growing, there were jobs available, this kind of thing. And what we often forget is that the type of inequality and segregation that we see in a lot of our cities today has really been there from the beginning. You know, when this migration first happened and as our cities have grown, that has been with us the whole time. And in many ways, it may be more acute now, it may be more visible now, maybe more salient some ways politically. But today, for example, we have 15 of the 25 most segregated cities in the US are located in the Great Lakes region. And just broadly speaking, we have high levels of income and wealth inequality. And a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times that can translate into lower government capacity when we have local governments and even state governments in some cases with lower revenue to draw on as a result, and I'll talk later about how that sometimes plays out in these policy spaces. Just to highlight some of these, what some of these numbers look like, if we look at household income in the region, this was some data we compiled looking at who within each state, kind of which racial group comprises the group with the lowest median household income in that state. And in every case, it's a group of color and often Black communities that have the lowest median household incomes. We also see what that looks like quantitatively, right? So this column on the right shows the gap between the income earned by that lowest earning group and the state average. So this isn't even the state maximum, but just the state average. So we're talking about some pretty, and often this is about a doubling between the lowest and the average. So these are big income and wealth gaps that we're facing in our region. This is part of a larger problem, a larger challenge of racial and economic inequality in the US. There was a recent story and kind of analysis that came out through the National Equity Atlas that really highlighted the pervasiveness of inequality in American cities broadly. I pulled out this quote here that says, "No place is actually doing well. Even the best performers have racial inequities that are unconscionable." So I think it's important to keep in mind. At the same time, you can see here also kind of where I don't mean to always kind of point to Detroit as the poster child here, but we can see where Detroit, as an example, falls on in this larger national context. So we have some acute and unique challenges as well. What this means in a climate adaptation context is we see persistent disparities in who is exposed to changing climatic conditions and hazard events, both the acute and the chronic, but also the capacities that people have for accommodating and adapting. And I think both at the individual level and at the collective level, say the municipal governments and this kind of thing as well. The one, we've done some mapping of some of these intersections for some of the cities in the Great Lakes. Just as an example, this is where we mapped flood risk in, we did 8 or 10 cities in the region. Here I'm just highlighting Chicago and Buffalo as examples. But what we did is we mapped the intersection of flood risk and BIPOC communities in these two cities, and the darker areas show parts of the city where those two intersect, where we see high flood risk and high proportions of BIPOC communities. And a lot of the patterns are what we might expect, where there's kind of a core set, a sort of core area of vulnerability and BIPOC communities, and some reduced vulnerability in the outskirts, outer areas. We see similar patterns. This is from a survey done by the Detroit Metropolitan Area Community Survey, showing the degree of unequal risk to flooding in Detroit. So this is based on survey data, but really showing the disparities on in terms of income in who's experienced flooding, who's had to leave their home because of flooding, and who's been made ill because of flooding in their home. The last dimension here of inequality that I want to highlight is this third bullet that I think is just important to bear in mind in a climate change context in particular, is the fact that the folks who are responsible for GHG emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions that are driving climate change, are not typically the same people who are most affected by a changing climate. So I pulled some figures out here from a recent paper showing that relationship between income and greenhouse gas emissions. Let's say figure A here on the left. And what's really driving a lot of this is consumption patterns, and that's what figure B is showing. So I think it's important to remember that there's kind of this double whammy where communities are highly exposed and at the same time least responsible. So then, teeing up the challenge and the research I want to talk about, then we have Great Lakes cities that are facing this intertwined challenge of climate change and inequality. The reality that adapting cities to climate change requires really a whole of city approach, so deep transformations to urban infrastructures and economies. This isn't tinkering around the edges. This is really about transforming the way we build and maintain and use and structure our cities. And so we know we have a need, we have various ideas of where we might want to go, but how do we get there? And that's what's motivating a lot of the research that I'm going to talk about next. So I'm going to talk about 3 different studies that we've done that are building toward an answer to this question. And I'll try to cover them in enough detail that it makes sense, but that we don't get totally bogged down in the details either. So first, I want to talk about a paper that came out in 2020, started in about 2018, that's really about taking stock of urban adaptation planning in the Great Lakes region and the extent to which cities are incorporating and accounting for justice and equity in their adaptation planning. And so first, let me just say a couple of things about how we think about justice and adaptation, how we know it when we see it, kind of thing. How do we define it? One shortcut I like to use is the idea of just adaptation, justly achieved. And so it really helps capture both the outcomes and the process. And so in the environmental justice space, we often talk about there being 3 dimensions of justice: procedural justice, distributive justice, and justice as recognition. So what these seek to cover is that the process is just, the process we go through to make a decision, to set priorities, to determine a budget, that these are inclusive and equitable processes, that the distribution of the resources or priorities coming from that decision are distributed equitably and reach the people who need them the most. And this third, justice as recognition, I like to think about this as finding ways to not only address current injustices, but really try to dig deeper and pinpoint and address the institutions and structures that are making people vulnerable in the first place. So to summarize, we want to be ensuring that adaptation targets and responds to those most vulnerable, doesn't perpetuate or exacerbate inequities, and addresses the root causes of vulnerability. So when I started this project, what I hadn't fully appreciated at the time, I was interested in seeing the extent to which cities were taking on these types of justice principles and incorporating them into their adaptation planning. But when I started to take a look at the landscape, there wasn't as much planning taking place as I had thought, and not as much as in other parts of the country. So I looked through what we would consider, or what I considered legacy cities in the region, meaning cities that had experienced some population loss, that had experienced kind of economic shift in their basic employment base. And when I looked through these, there were only 2 cities that really had concrete climate adaptation plans, and that was Detroit and Cleveland. So I decided to take those on as case study cities and dig deep into those 2. And the cities do have some interesting similarities and differences. Detroit's much larger, about almost twice the size of Cleveland. They both have had this significant population loss, more than half their population from the peak, almost double the national poverty rate, over 30% in both cases. And different racial compositions. Cleveland is about 40% white, where Detroit's only about 14% white. But again, they both had undertaken some formal planning for adaptation and provided an opportunity to understand that process. So looked at the plans themselves. I did interviews with people who had been involved with the plans, who worked in city government, who had helped create the plans, to try to get at some of those questions. So looking at what the plans contain, we had, and Detroit actually has 2 distinct plans, or at the time, I think there's even more, some additional planning underway at the moment. But in 2017, they had put together a climate action plan led by the Detroiters working for environmental justice and approved by City Council. They had some public engagement, they had a steering committee. The purpose was really to, because this was actually led from outside the city government, the purpose was to develop it outside city government and convince them that it was the right way to go. And they were successful in doing it. Thinking about, then looking at how the process and the plan itself reflects those justice principles. What I saw was a clear but fairly inconsistent focus primarily on distributive justice. So identifying places in the city where investments were most needed, particularly around heat and flooding. So they had undergone these vulnerability assessments that allowed them to identify those communities, both from a physical vulnerability and a social vulnerability perspective, who could benefit most from these investments. But there was less emphasis on this in other types of policy spaces like stormwater, drinking water, and green space. And they did frame this as an opportunity to both improve the economic prospects of these communities as well as reduce their vulnerability to climate change. In 2019, another plan emerged through the Mayor's Office of Sustainability that has a broader set of goals that include climate change adaptation and mitigation, but other types of goals as well. It was put on hold in a pretty significant way in 2020 when COVID caused so much disruption, and it's not clear to me at the moment where things stand. In Cleveland, they put together a climate action plan in 2018. They used a very a fairly robust public engagement process. The most interesting and perhaps innovative part of their plan is the development and use of this racial equity tool. Then they use that as a guiding tool for the entire plan. They also used vulnerability assessments to support distributive justice. And instead of framing adaptation as an economic opportunity, they really framed it as a way to right previous wrongs. They really dug into that restorative justice element. I'll say a little bit more about the racial equity tool because it is a really innovative and I think pretty important development. It's available. Folks who are involved with the plan development and implementation were trained in how to use it. And it really was meant to be a sort of screen that all decisions could pass through to make sure that the actions the city was going to take would not only not exacerbate racial inequality, but serve to forward racial equity. So the question I had was not only, how do they incorporate justice, or are they, kind of where do we see this emerging? But I was really curious to know why they did center justice to the extent that they did. They don't have to. A lot of cities don't. And so I think if that's something we want to see cities doing from a normative perspective, I think it's good to understand what leads them to take that on and foreground it when it's not necessarily required, let's say. And I found, talking to people and through the interviews, I thought there were both kind of top-down explanations for this and bottom-up explanations for this. So from a top-down perspective, what came through was the idea that at this point, I think due to some of the really acute and salient trends I mentioned earlier, I think it sounded like it was becoming impossible in some ways for decision makers not to acknowledge the sheer scale of poverty and inequality in their cities. There'd been enough attention brought to it locally, nationally, in some cases internationally, that it was starting to get through. So this is one quote from someone I interviewed that said, well, there's always somebody doing a poll someplace and Cleveland is in the top 10 or the #1 most segregated city, and people would just cringe. So I think in some respects anyway, it's just gotten to be such a salient and acute problem that it has to be in there. There's also this bottom-up explanation, meaning that this was something that grassroots and community organizations were demanding be included and addressed in the city's adaptation policies and programs. So another quote I pulled out here is someone who said, from the beginning, there has not been a top-down agenda setting initiative that we want people to support. Most of it is actually built around the idea that everyone needs to own it and for us to support innovation at the resident level and business level. So this is someone speaking from the city government perspective, like, this isn't us, we're really trying to have people have the community, have residents lead and own this, and this is what they want. So what are the remaining challenges here? We have these plans, we have some very good innovations, some very good intentions. There were definitely some challenges to implementation and really getting things off the ground. I include a photo here of my colleague, Manny Teodoro, who has now not only coined, but made into a t-shirt his go-to catchphrase: all policy is implementation, meaning we can have the best policy we want, it can be as well thought out as we want, but if it's not implemented, it's not going to get us where we want to go. And that's what I saw in these cities too, that implementation was a real challenge. There's a lack of information that they need sometimes to make the decisions they want to make, to know where the priorities should be. They often simply lack the people power or staff. A lot of these offices are highly understaffed. It might be 2 or 3 people charged with implementing one of these big plans. And budgets, of course, right? If there's not money behind it, it's not going to go very far. Oops. And similarly, but in a kind of different type of bucket of challenges to implementation, is the people in these cities are really seeing challenges around competing priorities. So yes, we want to do climate change, we want to do climate adaptation, but we're kind of seeing that in competition, as being in competition with other priorities we have. COVID certainly disrupted a lot of, not just in these cities, but a lot of cities' efforts in this space. And I think that as much effort as has been going into trying to make the link between economic well-being, economic prosperity, and resilience and climate adaptation in an empirical way, I think it's still difficult for both communities and decision makers to see those as actually linked, to think that that there are synergies between our economic goals for our communities, our community development goals, and these resilience goals, and see them instead as trade-offs or things that need to be in competition with one another. So taking up this challenge, then I'm going to talk about another effort we took on, kind of building on this. Okay, we've got this implementation challenge, we've got increasing awareness. I was at a workshop with a lot of sustainability managers from cities around the country, and that was a really common refrain, was we're aware, we even might have some good plans in place and good ideas, but we're not always sure how to take the next step, what resources are available, how to communicate our goals and this kind of thing. So what we did together with my colleague Kirsten Schwartz from UCLA, we received some funding from the Graham Sustainability Institute to convene a group of scholars and practitioners in an effort to co-create a set of resources and tools that could help local governments better foreground and better prioritize racial justice in their urban adaptation planning. So what this looked like, we went through a kind of iterative process, starting right in the throes of COVID shutdowns and whatnot in April of 2020. But we brought this group together, again, of kind of scholars and people working actively in the urban sustainability and adaptation space, to try to say, okay, what specifically is missing here? What specifically could we provide and add? And we had a series of workshops and meetings, different drafts of our plans and findings. And in the spring of last year, we released our final set of tools and resources that I'll describe in a bit more detail here. So one thing we did is we found that there are a whole host of existing toolkits and guides and resources and case studies that are already out there and want to serve to support city governments doing just the kinds of things that that we were interested in. And so one of the challenges from a city government perspective can be sorting through all of those and kind of knowing where to go, who has the best resources, who has the toolkit that fits my needs, and this kind of thing. So one thing we really ended up focusing on was how it was synthesizing and bringing together all the information that's already out there. And so one thing that generated was these 5 principles for centering racial justice as again, a kind of way of synthesizing and distilling the ideas that are already out there. And the ones that we were able to identify were focusing on root causes, institutionalizing representation, co-owning planning efforts with communities, centering equity in both data collection and analysis, and facilitating cross-sector collaboration. And so we put together a report, a set of one-pagers, a journal article, spreadsheets, all kinds of things. I'll show these in just a second. And part of what these included were both a kind of breakdown of what we mean or what these principles are meant to reflect. So for example, we say focus on root causes. We're talking about some of those restorative justice elements. So if racial segregation is contributing, for example, or poverty is contributing to climate vulnerability, how could we better target poverty and racial segregation as a way to reduce those vulnerabilities? And so we also then would provide case studies of where these were actually happening, where cities were actually doing this kind of work, and where then other cities could look to as examples for how they might be able to do that in their own city. And so we did this for all 5 of the principles. Talk about institutionalizing representation. What this means is really that one thing that has become clear out in the work that folks have already done is that organizations that are themselves representative of the community that they are serving are in a better position to meet the needs of that community, hear the needs of that community, be trusted by that community. And so a lot of this work in Principle 2 has to do with ways that an organization, let's say a planning department or sustainability office, could look internally to see or take steps to make sure that as an organization, their workforce, their hiring and retention practices reflect the community that they're trying to serve. Again, we provide some examples and resources for that. Co-owning planning efforts with communities is really about that shared decision making, shared priority setting in a way that's not just communities, giving feedback or being given information, but really a shared ownership over planning and investment. There's a lot of emphasis we place on centering equity in both the data collection and analysis process. We know from previous experience and other studies that there's a kind of adage in public management sometimes that you can't manage what you can't measure. But the flip side is also true, that you only perhaps manage what you can measure, and that can be problematic sometimes if you're not measuring the things people care about, if you're not measuring the things that you're not measuring the kinds of outcomes that you ultimately want to be improving. And so our data collection efforts can really unintentionally drive outcomes and investments that generate unequal outcomes or maybe don't meet the needs of those communities. And then finally, because this idea of centering justice in our efforts to adapt to climate change are so interdisciplinary, interdepartmental, it really requires cross-sector collaboration and working in new ways across departments, across levels of government, between government and communities. And again, we provide some examples of what that looks like. So like I said, we have a checklist for local governments, a toolkit inventory they can use, case studies of where some of these principles have really found success. This is all hosted now at the Graham Institute's website. I encourage you to take a look if you're interested. All right, and finally, I'll just talk quickly about this last piece that we're looking to contribute, is that cities, one thing that became clear is that we have all these recommendations for cities. Cities sometimes, again, may have good intentions and grand plans. One thing that can really make a difference for cities, especially lower or under-resourced cities, is support from their state governments. And so I think that a lot of times state governments can kind of fall through the cracks of where we as academics are looking, and where we're looking for information, where we're looking for influence, and where we're looking to engage as well. And so but we worked on this over the last couple of years with some funding from GLESA and in partnership with our colleagues in GLESA to really take a look at how state governments in the Great Lakes are doing when it comes to supporting local flood planning and local flood resilience, and how and provide some guidance on how that might improve. So we worked in partnership with GLESA as well as the Western Water Assessment to take this on, look at the policies and programs that states have and what they're providing for their local governments. So we wanted to operationalize those in a really systematic way, in an evaluative way. We developed a scoring system, kind of a scorecard for assessing state resources. We applied this to the eight Great Lakes states as well as 3 states in the Western region. I'll talk just about the Great Lakes states today. And we have just recently, I think in the last few weeks, released a short policy brief on this for practitioners, and the research is under peer review as well. So scoring state policies and programs, the way we went about this was in 4 steps. So first, we identified the types of policies and programs we should even be looking for at the state level. And so we identified 4 categories of things that states can do to support flood risk planning at the local level. And this was based on a kind of mix or an iterative process between the literature and previous studies and what we were seeing through some initial analyses of the states themselves. So the 4 categories we identified were information provision, planning guidance, regulations and standards, and funding and financing. Then once we had those 4 categories, we distinguished within each of them what we might consider standard practices, kind of things that states are either required to do or just everybody's doing them. And what are some of the more innovative practices, really ones that might be giving more attention to climate change, ones that are thinking creatively about how to make resources or guidance available. Then we assigned scores to each state on each category between 0 and 3. And so the total possible score for each state ranges from 0 to 12. And then we gave states stars when they included attention to equity and justice in their programs. So they could also get a total of 4 stars, up to 4 stars if they wanted, or if they had earned them. So this is what we found. This is what our scorecard ended up looking like. So we see a lot of variation between states. The height of the bar, the total height of the bar represents the total score. And then we break it down for each of the 4 subcategories, what score they got for that particular subcategory. So we see New York, for example, has the highest score of 11 and 1 star for their funding and financing. Minnesota's the second highest. They got a score of 10. They got 3 stars, so more attention to equity and justice in their policies and programs. I see a lot of states in between. Michigan, where I am, we got a 6, we got a 50%, but no equity stars, unfortunately. We have Illinois and Indiana currently with the furthest to go. So one thing we highlighted in the brief for policymakers in particular is where we see the most potential for improvement in the states given what we saw. And these were the 3 ideas that we wanted to put forward for states given this assessment. 1, every state has room to do more to center equity. And the nice part about having these resources now is that there are opportunities for states to look at what the others are doing to find, again, kind of like with the previous study I mentioned, where they might be able to take lessons from their neighbor, build on something that another state is doing. So we have lots of ideas now available for what that looks like. But again, that was probably the biggest gap we saw. I guess the other 2 are sort of the low-hanging fruit. One is, I think there's a lot states can do to create momentum across communities. So facilitate learning between cities, providing case studies, providing forums for communities to get together and learn from one another. There's a lot of room for states to play that role in a more proactive way, and also incentivizing and supporting desired action. So a lot of opportunity to better funnel resources and incentives for local governments in ways that induce the types of decision-making and planning that support climate resilience. That those are tools all states have currently and can make better use of. Okay, so I want to spend just a few minutes at the end here then talking about where we're looking to go next, how we're going forward, and just also generally where I think there's some really ripe opportunities for more interdisciplinary work in this space and work that can continue to support decision making for equitable adaptation. So here's a synthesis from a recent National Academies report on urban flooding. And I really like this because they synthesize their findings, right? They do the survey of the field and different case studies, and they synthesize it down to these 4 points. 1 is this idea that flood hazards are determined by this kind of complex set of processes, the natural environment, land use, and the infrastructure. That's helpful. They highlight, the unequal and uneven exposure of flooding, exposure to flooding of various types of marginalized communities. Also great. But I thought that I just wanted to highlight the second 2 also in particular. They found that people in the research, they saw that people want flood mitigation efforts and coordination, that there's public support for this. There's a public willingness perhaps to support this politically, support it administratively, support spending money on this, that it's an issue people care about and want attention to. And they also highlighted the fact that existing data are inadequate to provide an accurate estimate of the risk and damage of urban flooding. And I think more broadly, it's pretty clear that we don't have the data that are needed to really understand the extent and distribution of flood risk in our cities. And I think that's a big gap. And just one way of highlighting this, we took a stab at this in the city of Detroit, and we compared 3 different measures of flood risk that are currently available. 1, FEMA flood maps. So these are maps of the 100-year floodplain. These are used to guide the National Flood Insurance Program and other types of flood management policies. There's new data from the First Street Foundation, where they've created their own kind of set of algorithms that are now available at a national scale as a new and meant to be kind of new and improved way of measuring flood risk. And there's also survey data. We use survey data, again, from DMAX, where people reported whether they had had flooding occur in their homes or not. So if we just look at how these compare for the city of Detroit, here's a map of the 100-year floodplain in Detroit and what it looks like. So very low flood risk overall, a couple of parts of the city with concentrated flood risk. First Street Foundation's flood factor score paints a very different picture, right? More flood risk, higher flood risk overall, different parts of the city at higher risk than were highlighted before. And then if we look at the survey data where people had responded in a survey saying that their home was flooded, that paints a very different picture as well about who's at risk of flooding in the city. And I think that creates a really jumbled picture for decision makers who are trying to make priorities and just make decisions about investments, particularly under very constrained budget conditions. We have the new infrastructure funds available, which will be a huge help. But broadly speaking, we're trying to set priorities. And even if we're coming into it wanting to, invest in communities who need it the most, we may not always have the best the best information we need to make those investments. So I think that is a really big gap. So I think some of the key next steps here are developing new tools for measuring and monitoring flood risk that not only improve accuracy, but also, again, thinking about those principles before, center equity in both the collection of the data and the way we use those data to make decisions. I think also there's a lot to be gained from understanding where these risks come from specifically, right? We know that they're uneven. We know that they're related to our infrastructure investments and distributions, but exactly what's driving these risks from an institutional and political perspective, and where are the policy levers that we really have available to us to pursue the kind of adaptation we want to see. And again, using this kind of integrated understanding to support adaptation strategies toward just outcomes. I'll just highlight one other way we're working on this going forward. We have a brand new project funded through SEAS, actually, working with my colleagues Seth Gaikama and Run Ziwang. And we're kind of flipping it around a little bit to try to see not how, instead of asking, kind of how our flood risk information can feed into policy, we're asking, well, how do these, can we get a handle on how policy choices made at the local level are contributing in a measurable way to stormwater outcomes. And we're going to be focusing initially on the Rouge River watershed. And so with that, I will say thank you again for the opportunity to share this research. And I'm really hoping there's some questions and opportunities to chat a little bit. I don't know, does it make sense for me to do this?
Yeah, I think that works, Sarah. Thank you very much for that wonderful talk. I think I'll invite Nicole Rice to go ahead and moderate the questions. Nicole, are you available there?
If not, I'm here, Greg, and I can do it. This is Mary.
Okay, yeah, go for it, Mary.
Okay, so I think we have a hand. Yeah, if people have questions for Sarah, you can either raise your hand and we will unmute you, or you may enter a question in the chat box and I can read that for Sarah. So Stephanie White, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. I see your hand is up.
Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So my name is Stephanie White. I work for the Division of Environmental Health at the state for MDHHS, and I work as an environmental health communicator for MyChap, which is the Climate and Health Program. So it was a great presentation. Thank you very much. Really interesting. Really we focus on the health outcomes, but we're like flooding is definitely one of the things we're focused on and the effect on health. The whole presentation was really interesting, but that last bit that you showed about that different metrics, First Street versus FEMA versus survey data. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit. I know we've looked at the difference between First Street and FEMA. The survey data is really interesting. And I wonder, do you think that's in part because it's a function of self-reported data, or like are people thinking about flooding differently? Like, are there different definitions of flooding, or like what's the issue there? If you can speak about it at all.
Yeah, I agree. It is super interesting, and we're trying to dig into it too. We've been writing some proposals on this actually, and I'll just flag as well that there's a group at Wayne State with Mike Thompson who's done some similar type of survey work in greater detail for smaller parts of the city. So they'll like go door to door and ask people questions about this, but they've got, kind of 3 or 4 parts of the city where they've been working, but also really interesting results and an interesting method for collecting the information. And so I think it is in some ways a nut to crack, but I'm inclined, again, so I'm not an engineer, so I don't, have maybe as much in-depth expertise about, some of the engineering dynamics that go into some of the models. But my intuition is that the models, from what I understand, are very imperfect, and they're bringing together estimates about the way a lot of different systems interact, like slope and the stormwater pipes and household characteristics and this kind of thing, and that because stormwater flooding is so site specific, right? It could be even having to do with how somebody's maintaining their yard, that it's really difficult to get really accurate information out of a model. So I myself am fairly inclined to believe the survey data, quote unquote. No, but with the caveat, like you said, these are self-reported data. Are they thinking about it the way we think that they're thinking about it? So I guess in some ways the answer is that we should be spending more time figuring that out, right? That if you were to go door to door and had greater confidence that the answers you were getting were the ones you wanted, does that line up with survey data? Or, does that support that? Does that look more like survey data, or does that look more like First Street data? These kind of like validation processes maybe. I know there's also folks who do participatory stormwater flood mapping, like in a kind of group setting, a neighborhood setting. I think that could be interesting too. But I think that anyway, not to belabor it too much, but I feel like because there is such site specific dimensions to it, that even in a broad sense, any coherent picture of stormwater flooding, to me, it just seems like it has to include some kind of experience data or that fine-grained look.
Yeah, agree. Thank you very much. That's really interesting.
Sure.
Okay, our next question will be from Mike McKay. Mike, I'm going to allow you to unmute.
Thanks, Mary. Yeah, Mike McKay. I'm the Executive Director of the Great Lakes Institute for Environmental Research, University of Windsor. Thanks, Sarah. That was a really interesting perspective. Now, the perspectives you shared seem to be informed mainly from urban experiences. Can you share with us, or are you aware of work by your colleagues that help to inform this narrative from the perspective of tribal First Nations communities? Certainly in more northern areas of the Great Lakes, the upper Great Lakes, those communities are likely disproportionately affected by climate change. And so interested to hear your perspectives on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And definitely missing from this. So thank you for raising that. I'm not myself aware of even research to point you to on that, I guess for flooding in particular, but my colleague Kyle White here at SEAS has done amazing work on climate or tribal climate politics and activism and vulnerability broadly. And I think this came up another time this week too. And so I actually have been kind of racking my brain, or thinking anyway this week about the sort of tribal flooding link or where to look for that. But I don't have anything other than to say definitely look at my colleague Kyle White's work in this space. It's really pretty cutting edge, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Okay, so we've got a few more minutes for questions. We have a few in the chat box that I will read for you, Sara. So Our next question is from Mike Murray. He says, thanks, Sara. Can you elaborate a little more on the potential for federal programs and funding, including through the new infrastructure legislation, to advance this work in the coming years, both at the state and local levels?
Yeah, that's great. And so I think that I'm really excited about all the funding that's coming down the pike or meant to be soon. And a lot of times, I think that's the role that the federal government can play best, honestly, is that source of, big pots of money that other levels of government just don't always have access to. And so I really like the idea of the federal government providing those big pots of money. We used to do that for infrastructure, especially on the water side, a lot more than we do now, right? When we were building wastewater treatment plants, when we were building our stormwater systems, a lot of that came from out of big federal investments. So I think it's a really good thing. I think that right now what I see is a lot of uncertainty around how to spend those funds. And the federal government wants emphasis on equity, right? We've got the EJ40. A lot of states, a lot of local communities want that too. And operationalizing those priorities and identifying how to best spend this money, is slowing things down a bit. What I'm hoping is that it's an opportunity to make those decisions and develop those frameworks, right? When we have, $500 million to spend, this is how we do it. And this is how we prioritize the communities and the projects we want to move forward. We haven't, I guess, maybe had that good problem for a while. So I'm hoping that we'll kind of move through that and come out with better systems for spending money than we have currently, and that it will, that they will continue to emphasize, as we've seen, the federal government trying to do with EJ40, that they'll try to be emphasizing investments in marginalized communities and EJ communities in ways that don't, honestly, that don't just create more paperwork and barriers to access either.
Thank you, Sara. We have one more question, and if you're okay, we only have one more minute, but I'm hoping you're okay staying on for quickly just to answer this one.
Yeah.
So from Jesse Fayan, Jesse writes that he agrees that tools like First Street, FEMA flood maps, and reports of flooding are likely linked to different flooding risk determination methodologies. It should be explored further, as I doubt that these are apple to apples comparisons. My question from climate justice policy perspective is about situations like high-risk repetitive loss properties in vulnerable communities. What policy approaches do you think should be considered for these specific concerns?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what to do about buildings of any kind, residential buildings, what to do about people that are currently in harm's way, right? Who are living in these really vulnerable places, either due to like past experience or where we could pretty well expect for that to be the case going forward. I think there's some really interesting policy experiments going on with this in different communities, and some really neat research going on too. And I think that there's a lot to be said for getting community perspectives on how these priorities should be set. I think that it's one of those challenges that I don't think will kind of move through in a top-down way that will not cause more harm or resentment or disruption for these communities. So I think that in a broad sense, I think that the more democratic and engaged those decision-making processes can be, the better outcomes we'll see. And then ultimately, you know, kind of similar to this spending the funds question too, you know, these are decisions that we need to make as community, as a society, how to deal with risk and how to move these investments forward. It's a good question, and one that a lot of communities are grappling with very actively, as I'm sure you're aware.
Okay, that is all the questions we have. Greg, did you have any parting words you'd like to say to the audience?
I just want to thank you, Sara, for the talk. It was fantastic, and I want to thank everyone for attending. It's really great to see another audience of healthy size at this time of summer, the height of vacation and field season. So thanks everybody for attending. Our next seminar will be August 2nd with Andrew Alt from the Department of Chemistry at Michigan. So please keep your eye out for announcements and links. Again, thank you and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.